This recording is an introduction to the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system is one of the motor divisions of our nervous system. So remember, the peripheral nervous system has the sensory and motor division, and that motor division is broken up into somatic motor division, which is involved in controlling skeletal muscle movement. But the autonomic nervous system, sometimes referred to as the visceral motor division, that is going to be involved in controlling smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, adipose tissue, so it's different from the somatic motor division. That is broken up into two divisions. We have the sympathetic, which is referred to as the fight or flight division, which is going to be active when you're in fear, you're fighting, you're fleeing from something. And then we have the parasympathetic division, which we're usually in parasympathetic mode more often. That's like the rest and digest division. Now notice that the words are very similar. You got parasympathetic and sympathetic because the parasympathetic runs along with the sympathetic division. That's why it's referred to as parasympathetic. Now, the sympathetic, I had mentioned, were fight or flight. So if you have a snake, if I saw that snake there, I'd probably pass out. But when you're in fight or flight, that sympathetic nervous system is going to dominate. When you're kind of hanging out, rest and digest, and just chilling, you're going to be more parasympathetic. Okay, so in the picture says, homeostasis is a balance between the two branches. Now one thing I do want to go and do again is I have in a previous recording compared the somatic versus the autonomic motor pathways. And so we're going to be looking at this one here. Okay, so we'll be referring to that autonomic motor pathways. One of the things you'll notice, it involves ganglia, which are groups of cell bodies that are located in the outside of the central nervous system. Remember, the term nuclei is a term for cell bodies that are located within the central nervous system. With the autonomic pathways, we'll be referring to what we call preganglionic neurons, which you see the cell bodies start in the central nervous system. But the postganglionic neuron, the cell bodies are going to be located within these ganglia. So the postganglionic neuron is what's going to innervate the effectors. So let's do kind of some differences between somatic nervous system with the autonomic nervous system, but also show there's differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So remember, the effector organs are different. Somatic, it's skeletal muscle. It's a voluntary muscle. The autonomic nervous system includes your involuntary muscles, smooth and cardiac muscle, as well as glands, as well as adipose tissue. We can include that too. The cell body of the neuron that we see that's going to innervate that skeletal muscle, that is going to be located in the central nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, we have these two neurons. The preganglionic neuron, the cell body, is in the central nervous system, but we employ ganglia where we have the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons going to be located within the ganglia. So there's one difference there. With the somatic nervous system, the axons are heavily myelinated. While when we look at the autonomic nervous system, the axons of preganglionic neurons are lightly myelinated, and then the axons of the postganglionic neurons are not myelinated at all. So there's a difference there too. So if you think about what's going to be a result of that. So remember, more myelin, that's going to have a faster speed of conduction versus an unmyelinated axon. You also, the neurotransmitter released by the somatic motor neurons is always acetylcholine. And it's always excitatory. So it binds to nicotinic receptors on the skeletal muscle, and which are ligand-gated sodium channels. So that results in depolarization, get enough the change in membrane potential. Where you reach threshold, you will generate an action potential. And so these are always excitatory. Now, if we look at the autonomic nervous system, the neurotransmitters will vary. Typically, there's always exceptions. So typically, the sympathetic nerve endings, I should say, the postganglionic neurons, the sympathetic nervous system, they release norepinephrine. And that could be, depending on the target, it could have excitatory or inhibitory effects. So it all depends upon what type of receptor is located on the target. With the adrenal medulla is this inner part of the adrenal gland, and it's actually a modified sympathetic ganglion. So the postganglionic neurons, and I'm using air quotes here, they've kind of lost their dendrites, they lost their axons, so you pretty much have cell bodies that will respond to the innervation from this preganglionic neuron. In response, release these two hormones into the bloodstream. And they will bind to the same type of receptors that we have that would norepinephrine released by the sympathetic nerve endings would bind to. And the effects, again, could be excitatory or inhibitory. Now, with the parasympathetic division, is the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. So you won't see norepinephrine, you see acetylcholine. The target organs, the receptors for acetylcholine are muscarinic receptors. So they are not ligand-gated sodium channels. They're G protein coupled receptors. And the effects on the target can be excitatory or inhibitory depending on the specific type of muscarinic receptor. Now, one thing we'll notice, though, is that the preganglionic neurons, I'm going to erase this here, of the autonomic nervous system, they all do release acetylcholine. So you notice it's always acetylcholine here, always acetylcholine. And the receptors for it that you find here, those are nicotinic receptors. Okay, so that's a commonality there. But one thing that you'll notice is if you look at the picture carefully, I'm going to erase it so you can look at it a little bit better, is the preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system, division of the ANS. The preganglionic neurons are short. The postganglionic neurons are long because the ganglion is closer to where the spinal cord is. The postganglionic neurons have to be longer, so you got to travel a lot farther to find the effectors. But with the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic fibers, the axon should say, were fibers, those are long. The ganglion's closer to where the effector is, wherever the target is. So the postganglionic fiber, the axon, is shorter. So there's a difference in kind of just structure too. So there's differences within the autonomic nervous system in regards to neurotransmitters. It's also in regards to like the length of the axons of the pre and postganglionic neurons. But other than that, they do have either, depending on the specific receptor, could be excitatory or inhibitory. Well, in the somatic nervous system, it's excitatory. Now, other thing about this parasympathetic and sympathetic, they have other names for them. So the sympathetic nervous system is referred to as the thoracolumbar division. I'm going to write it right across the screen. So it's called the thoracolumbar division because the cell bodies of the preganglionic neuron are located within the lateral gray horns of the T1 through L2 spinal cord segments. Remember learning about that lateral gray horn. What was found in it? It's the cell bodies of visceral motor neurons, and these are what we're talking about now. So it's actually preganglionic neurons that are of the sympathetic nervous system. So that's why they call this the thoracolumbar division. Now, the parasympathetic division is referred to as the craniosacral. I'm going to write it right across the screen. Craniosacral division, because with this one, the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are up either in the brainstem, so cranium, think head. So it's up either in the brainstem, or it's in the S2, 3, and 4 segments of the spinal cord. Now, S2, 3, and 4 do not have lateral gray horns, but the cell bodies of these neurons are more on the lateral aspect of that gray matter that's in the spinal cord. So the cranial sacral, and also if you look very carefully, and it was kind of hard to see, so I'm going to erase this. So you notice there you see cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Ocular motor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and cranial. You'll hear about those a little bit more later. So they're going to be innervating certain structures up in the head, or in case of the vagus, which is cranial nerve 10, that's the only one that actually is not innervating something up in the head, but it innervates like your heart and your lungs and things like that. So the picture, you can see all the different innervation, and we'll talk about those in different recordings. So this is just the introduction to the autonomic nervous system. So you'll have separate recordings that go over the anatomy of both divisions, as well as the physiology of both divisions.